Absolutely wonderful to see everyone coming in. I will share my slide deck and we'll get started here in just a minute. My name is Tim Rusk. I'm with the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. Super excited to be with you all today and with Scott to talk about financial strategy. Am I sharing my slides? I think they are.
Yes. Yeah, I can see them.
Perfect. So we're all virtually in Corvallis in the Mid-Willamette Valley. We're at the Mid-Valley Nonprofit Regional Network. And yeah, so again, just welcome everyone. So we'll start with just a reminder about the mission statement of the Nonprofit Association of Oregon. Our goal is to strengthen the collective voice, leadership, and capacity of nonprofits all across the state and across the nation. We care about all the nonprofits, and we see that work improving the lives of Oregonians. Um, so we do 4 different programs. One is capacity building. So we do workshops, things like this. As I mentioned, we're in one of the regional networks attending virtually, but we have a total of 7 different regional networks. So we do a lot of training work out there and workshops. We also do conferences, which come under the banner of convening. I have a slide deck. I have a slide at the end that'll let you know about some of the conferences. We do advocacy work, both at the state and federal level, and that's important, especially right now. As a matter of fact, we have an event tomorrow between noon and 1 where we talk a bit about the executive orders that have been coming out and what they may mean for nonprofits. So we also do membership services, so discounts on trainings, discounts on insurance, access to just some of the resources that NAO has out there. And of course, here's a slide about the membership program in particular. So encourage you all to consider becoming members. As always, in every nonprofit, we want to thank the sponsors and funders that make this particular network happen, especially the Benton Community Foundation, but also the more general support that NAO gets from the Roundhouse Foundation, Ford Family, Meyer Murdoch, and the Marie Lamfrom and other supporters. So we couldn't do what we do without the support of them. So just a couple of housekeeping things before I turn it over to Scott. I happen to know there's a big slide deck, which Scott will mention. You'll get that and the recording for this session sent out afterwards. Usually it comes about a day after the workshop. Um, I think that's it for housekeeping. So with that, let me just say I'm absolutely thrilled to have Scott here. I've done a few different workshops with Scott. I think you're really in for a treat. And Scott has that great combination of backgrounds. He's been executive director at a few different, both regional nonprofits. He also wears the hat of a consultant, and he's a principal at the Public Interest Management Group. And he's also a researcher. So he's got that more analytical approach, kind of been in the field, doing research, writing some papers, and yeah, and has a passion for financial strategy and helping nonprofits succeed. So, oh, one last piece, Scott, before I turn it over to you. If you would put your name, where you are, and what you do in your organization in the chat, um, just love to go ahead and collect that. Scott, I think it's yours.
Well, thank you, Tim. That was you conveyed much information in a very short time there, and I appreciate it. It's really great to be here and to see all the faces of folks who are here joining us. This is a big topic we're covering today, and so I will dive right into it. It's financial strategy for nonprofit leaders, and let me make sure that, yeah, there we go. Um, I am a consultant. This is my consulting practice. It's called Public Interest Management Group, or PIM Group. And we do a lot of work with organizations around financial strategy. Often it's developing a strategic business plan, and sometimes it's more focused analytic work. But that question of financial health and sustainability is a big one, I think, for many organizations, and that's our focus in a lot of the work that we do. So overview of this session, we have just 90 minutes and we're covering topics, many of which could easily fill up a day, but we all are very busy. And so, we're going to give a broad swath in an hour and a half of elements of financial strategy. So there are three parts. And in some cases, I'll give you a warning up front. In some cases, we're going to introduce a topic that we could go down the rabbit hole literally for hours. In some cases, entire sessions have been done on what I'm reducing to one slide and just a mention. So I just want to tell you about my philosophy here. I want to give you the overview of everything you can think about for financial strategy. In some cases, I will have resources, or you may find others on your own, where you can dig deeper after this session if you're interested. So I'll point that out when I get there. But we're going to cover a lot, and some topics we're going to cover very briefly, just to make sure that it's here. And this slide deck can be a reference for you, and you'll get that. So I'm hoping that by the end of this session, you'll be able to explain the importance of financial strategy as a part of your organization's planning, frame big financial questions for your organization. Also, explain what types of data can be helpful to you in decision making, and identify tangible steps you can take to building a financial strategy. So that's an ambitious goal. So what is financial strategy? Let's start with that. Well, what am I talking about with this term? And here's a reasonable definition on the screen now. And that word "with" is in italics because it's a detailed vision. It's not just here's where we want to be. It's including a lot of those essential pieces of information that have been developed and vetted and help define where we want to go with some specificity. Now, why? Why would we want to have a financial strategy? Doesn't that seem kind of like a business thing? And we're running nonprofits. We've got other things to worry about other than money. And in fact, we do need to worry about money. So the three main reasons are: one is just to maximize the impact we can make with the resources that we have. The one in the middle is a big one, perhaps more now than it was a few months ago, is navigating risk. And where do we have risk? Do we have risk with our funding streams? Do we have risk with certain elements of the economy? Do we have risk with our services staying relevant or being fundable? And then the third area is to seize opportunities. So if we have a financial strategy, we're going to be better at doing all three of these if we have a robust financial strategy. So, and I'm guessing that you all are self-selected for people who probably already get that. You're the ones who signed up for this workshop. So I don't imagine that's a hard sell. But as I think about financial strategy, it's not a separate thing, like tucked away off to the side. It's part of an overall organizational strategy. It is holistically tied to your programs and what your programmatic strategy is, as well as your operations, the biggest piece of which is staffing. And so all these things to me come together. It's not something you can just tell your accountant or your finance manager, could you just develop a financial strategy and we'll include that in the board packet. It's something that has to be integrated with your whole plan for the organization. So what does a financial strategy include? Well, there's a bunch of bullet points here. And the point here, the overall point that I'll emphasize is specificity. And this slide shows the types of specificity that we would want in a robust financial strategy, including a contingency plan, because we cannot predict the future. And I don't know, after this week, it feels like we can't predict next Monday. We're living in a time where things happen quickly and they're not predictable. Not that there ever was a time where the future was predictable, but I think it felt like it evolved a little more of a deliberate pace 20 or 30 years ago. So the more nimble we can be, the better off we're going to be. And that's part of I think the benefit of a financial strategy. It can help you be nimble. And if we're explicit about our assumptions, then when we need to change them, we know what we're changing, and we can have a discussion of why. So it makes us more proactive and less reactive. These are some characteristics that a financial strategy has. It is systematic and it's systemic. So systemic meaning it affects your entire organization. Systematic meaning it's not haphazard. We have a process in place, and we're going to follow that process. The process is kind of self-reinforcing, and there are feedback loops in it. Database decision making is something that I could talk about that piece all day. I think it's very important to make sure our decisions are informed, so we're not simply using our intuition to make decisions. And then we have flexibility. So we can make course corrections when things don't go as we predicted. And let's face it, they never do. So in the best case, we were fairly accurate, but something's going to happen that we didn't predict. So what would a strategy look like? Well, here are 3 possible forms it can take. I'm not dogmatic about, here's the type of plan you have to have. In fact, if you can have a strategy without even having a strategic plan, the strategy is the important part. The strategy is that vision and kind of a map of how we're going to get to where we want to go in that vision. So it can be a standalone document. It can be a formal business plan. It can be a chapter of a strategic plan. That is purely up to you. And another thing I'll mention, because there's a big difference between a small organization and a larger organization. In my first executive director job, I walked in the door. I was one of 4 employees, and one of the first things that happened that morning is one of the 4 quit. So I was one of 3 employees, and so we had a lot of work to do, the 3 of us. When I left that job, we had 40 employees, and that was quite some years later. And at that point in time, we could assign work to a lot of people, and we had a little bit more sophistication in terms of the type of plan we could develop. But my point here is, even that small organization should and can have a financial strategy. It might be simpler. It might include only certain essential elements, but it's the same principle applies to all of them. Okay, so when we realize a financial strategy, it should hit these points here. It can be highly detailed. It can be simpler. It should be dynamic, meaning it can be adjusted from year to year. And it should address whatever your organization's particular and unique needs are. There's no generic strategic plan. There's no generic financial strategy. So it needs to be customized, and then it should be co-owned by your key stakeholders. Key stakeholders would include your board, your staff. Those are the internal stakeholders. You might have other volunteers that play an important role. You probably have external stakeholders such as funders, interested community members. What about your clients? Clients who are using your services, or the public that you're serving, and even the community that you're serving. So you can have a variety of stakeholders, and to an extent, your key stakeholders should see themselves reflected in that strategy, and it can help you tell the story, which is something I'm going to talk about a number of times today. So, big questions. Every nonprofit will have a list of big questions around finance. And I'm going to give you some examples here. So you can look at the list, but think in your own back of your own mind, well, what are our big financial questions? And some of these are a little bit technical, but these are common to organizations. At least some of them probably would affect most nonprofits. So first one is about risk with regard to our revenue structure. I'll talk about what revenue structure is, the concept. Cash reserves. How much cash reserves should we have? I've worked with organizations where I'll talk to board members and say that, we have a really great cash reserve. Well, what does that mean? Sometimes they'll say they have a really great cash reserve, and they'll say, yeah, well, we have 2 months of expenses in the bank. That's really great. Well, it's actually not that great. It's better than average, believe it or not, but that's not necessarily good. So what are the standards that we are comparing this to? That's an important thing to look at. What level of staffing growth can we sustain? How can we become more competitive in the job market? This is a big topic the last several years with nonprofits. And that's a financial question, as well as a question of how do we recruit, and a lot of things about our workplace and so on. Restricted grants, that's an important topic for nonprofits. Will they help or hurt our financial position? Sometimes getting more restricted grants, though it might feel good when you get the grant, it actually can harm your financial position down the road. And a financial strategy can help address that. What investments can we make? And how will we pay for them? Sometimes spending money gets us more money, and the inverse of that is sometimes by being too thrifty, shall I say, we can actually harm our financial position. We aren't spending money on the right things. And then, a question that is common to a lot of organizations, even very well-run organizations, is how can we turn around chronic operating deficits? What are the scenarios we could consider? So these are some possible big questions. They probably don't all apply to your organization, and you might have some others. Okay. So another big question that probably does apply to every nonprofit is, who should be aligned with our financial strategy to ensure we're successful? So our strategy can't exist in a vacuum. So I'd like you to reflect for just a moment. So I'm not asking anyone to respond to this, but just think about it in your mind. What major concerns do you have about your organization's finances? What are the things that hopefully don't, but could keep you up at night? What big opportunities exist for your organization next year and beyond? And so a financial strategy can address both of those. So think about that in your mind, and think about that as we go through this process today. And we will have a time to talk and ask questions in real time today. So keep that in mind. So now that we know what financial strategy is, I'd like to talk a little bit about strategic thinking. And strategic thinking, so in this illustration up here, we're looking down at a city from above. Big picture view tells us a lot about the dynamics of the city that we wouldn't see at street level. Of course, at street level, we'd see a lot of details that we don't see from, a few thousand feet in the air. But strategic thinking is the big picture view. So you want to have enough details to make your plan practical and realistic, but you don't need to consider every detail. Big picture view. We're going to talk about drawing meaning from data and some key metrics for financial health. And we're going to talk about telling a story with numbers. In fact, you can think about a strategy as a story. And I would argue that that is the best way to communicate about a strategy, is to tell a story. Financial data. What is the importance of financial data? The entire importance of data, I would argue, is to tell a story. If we're not telling a story with data, then what is the point? I mean, we can have pages and pages and pages of financial reports. I mean, sometimes it's important to have all that for reference. But the question I want to think about is, well, what is the story? What story is it telling? And that's why we have data. You can think about like weather and climate data. You can think about election data, sports statistics. It's not all trivia. It's there to tell us a story. And what is the important story? All numbers are not created equal. And I was, as a kid, I was interested in numbers. And this won't surprise you after you get through this session. Yeah, I like numbers. I was that kind of a kid. And I would be good at keying in on the most trivial, obscure numbers and like things like baseball stats. And I would talk to people about it, and I'd be puzzled, like, why didn't you think that was completely fascinating? And well, sometimes stuff is interesting on a certain level, but it's actually not that important. We want to use the right data and use it well. And so the obscure, interesting things I was looking at were not necessarily the most important pieces of information to tell any particular story. And so let's think about financial data in terms of how do we pull out those nuggets, which are really important. So this is illustrative. This isn't, don't take it literally, the 5% is essential, but a very small amount of any data set is actually going to be essential to telling that big picture story. And for financial strategy, this is the 5% we want to be working on. There's another 20% that, yeah, it's good to have it there, and it can deepen the story, help fill out the plot line, maybe inform us a little more about those essential points. And then 75% is probably trivial. This is a rhetorical question that I often ask, and it's great to see the facial expressions on the audience. Have you ever been in a board meeting where a board member, you're doing a budget presentation, a proposed budget, board member raises his hand and he says, with some level of anger, I want to know why the paperclips budget went up by 60%. And it went up from like $10 to $16. And your budget's $3 million. And that's trivia. There might have been a good reason why we needed more paper clips. But here we are spending valuable board time. They don't meet very often. They don't meet for very long. The budget's really important. And here we are talking about paper clips and that $6 difference. And the essential data is different from that, but I always end up defending that board member because, and I was guilty of this, if that was a real experience that happened to me. He was actually looking at office supplies, not paper clips, but so I dramatized it a little bit. But the point was, the way I and my staff had presented the budget, it actually led the reader's eyes to that number and made it look like that was more important than it was. So in other words, I gave them too much information. So I couldn't really complain when they absorbed it the way it was presented. So we think about the essential data. Not only can we try to focus on that, we can actually present it that way in our reporting. Now, what are the standards of financial health? This is a really important question. How do we know when we're financially healthy, and how do we know we're not? Well, there are dozens and dozens of possible financial metrics, and for most organizations, I think exactly 2 are essential to understanding your financial health. I'm not saying the others aren't interesting, but they're just not essential. So, number 1, consistent operating surpluses. Do we have surpluses? I think a good number to aim for is between 2 and 5%. Again, nothing magic about that, but why 2 to 5%? Because if it was much higher than that, perhaps we are not spending enough money on our mission. And perhaps even in some cases, we could be endangering our nonprofit status. Nonprofits are not set up to make big profits, though we are certainly allowed to make profits. Consistent operating surpluses, you'll notice that the low end of that is 2%. It's not break even. It's not 0%. A 0% surplus would be a break even budget. And an organization that breaks even year after year after year after year is actually going to be losing ground to inflation. You're probably going to be losing ground on your second key metric, which is unrestricted cash. So I think nonprofits should be making surpluses, should be earning surpluses through their operations. But perhaps the most important metric for health is how much unrestricted cash do you have? And this is not restricted cash. This is excluding restricted cash, because restricted cash is different, and you can't use that necessarily to meet your payroll or pay other bills. You have to monitor and manage restricted cash differently. So for most organizations, the reason that asterisk there is that there are always exceptions, but unrestricted cash, I think for organizations that do fundraising or raise at least 50% of their revenue through philanthropy, one way or another, I think they should aim for 6 to 12 months unrestricted cash. That's a healthy organization. If you have less than that, that doesn't mean you're in danger of going bankrupt, but it can mean that a shock to the system can be very disruptive. And so that unrestricted cash is a security blanket for you. And what I call that is sleep. You have a nice unrestricted cash reserve, you can sleep. You know, something bad happens, you don't have to worry about it immediately. You don't have to, you can deal with it in a planned way.
Scott, there's a question in the chat around, so are you talking about board designated, like a board designated reserve? Is that unrestricted typically?
Board designated funds by definition are unrestricted. The board cannot restrict cash. Restricted has a very specific definition, and it means it's donor restricted. So yes, a board designated reserve would be included within unrestricted cash, though no designation is necessary for unrestricted cash. It's just an option that a board can have. Often unrestricted cash, some unrestricted cash will be set aside in an operating reserve, and that's fine. It's actually a nice way to represent it on financial statements, so you know why it's there. There's a lot we can talk about this 6 to 12 months and how people perceive that. I'll set that aside for now. I will say this: for organizations that have fee-for-service income that is highly predictable, and that is more than 50% of their revenue, I think 3 to 6 months is an adequate unrestricted cash balance on an ongoing basis. So That's because fee-for-service income can be very predictable. It doesn't have the risk level that fundraising does, particularly grant fundraising, which is the highest risk funding stream. So consider that in your organization's circumstances. Now, I have this third one here. This is for organizations that have a lot of real estate, and they have another metric, capital reserve health. And that's a whole separate conversation that we don't have time for, and it doesn't affect most organizations. But I think that it is possible for that type of organization to be strong on these first two metrics and then weak on the third one, which can raise some questions that should be addressed in a financial strategy.
That's basically money set aside in case the roof fails, or it's that reserve
Yes,
to take care of the capital asset. That's what you're talking about, right?
it is. It's not in case the roof fails, Tim. It's when the roof is ready to fail. So when, in case the roof fails, that actually might be an operating reserve, because that would be unexpected, hopefully. But every roof has an expected lifespan, and so you would do you would have a capital reserve plan, and that would tell you this is how much money we need. And I can tell you, 100% of the organizations I've seen don't have a fully funded, these are nonprofits, don't have a fully funded capital reserve. And in fact, most often it's much, much lower than 100%. So it can be a really big deal for those organizations like housing providers. It's something to consider. But I'll tell you what, if I had to choose, I would rather be strong on these first two and weak on that third one than the other way around. Because you need to stay in business to have the time to build a good capital reserve. So that was an important slide. Here's another slide you can consider. And this is what I think of if I had to pick 5 key metrics that would tell us an informed story about the financial health of an organization. Here are 5 metrics I'd want to know about. Number 1 is how many months of unrestricted cash you have. And really, that's probably more important than the other 4 combined. But there's a reason I put that first. The second one is structural budget surplus. Structural budget surplus is something that doesn't appear on financial statements. It's a calculation, and that's a term that I use. It's not an accounting term per se, but if you take out those unexpected or one-time expenses and income sources that won't be renewed, and then you ask the question, okay, how does our budget look? How does our actual financial performance look? Like if we didn't get a big bequest last year, instead of having a 30% budget surplus, we might have had a 5% budget deficit. And so it tells a different story. So I want to know the structural budget surplus. The third one is the current ratio. And this is simply a mathematical ratio of current assets, divided by current liabilities. Those are both things that appear on every balance sheet. The balance sheet is also called the statement of financial position. It's one of the 2 major financial statements. Current ratio is a standard metric for liquidity, and it tells a little bit of the story. Program and activity profitability, I'm going to touch on that. That's an unusual one, and I'm going to touch on that in just a little bit. And then income risk indicator, this is something that basically comes down to, it's something you can use in budgeting, which is rather than saying, for example, okay, we believe we're going to get a Meyer Foundation grant for $150,000. So let's plan for that. And then we have 6 other grants we believe we're likely to get, so we plan for those. Income risk indicator would be a way to apply in budgeting some likelihood that you'll get a source of funding or that you won't. And so it builds in conservatism. And so how risky are our funding sources that we're planning on. So when charted over time, these 5 elements will really tell a story about how our situation is evolving and where we are now. Now, here's a question to think about. How many of these 5 metrics are on typical financial statements? Think of a number in your head. There a number between 0 and 5. And the answer is 0. None of them are on a financial statement. There is one, and it's the one in the middle, current ratio, that you can count. You can sort of do the math in your head, or you can write it down and do the quick calculation. That one, at least the raw numbers, are on financial statements. Most financial statements for nonprofits don't even have unrestricted cash on the balance sheet. I have increasingly seen more audits that do indicate unrestricted cash, but it's less common. It's more common that they lump all the cash together. So the interesting thing here is the financial statements, which have their purpose, and I love accounting. I'm glad that we have it, but it doesn't tell the financial big picture the way we might like to. So we have to do a little more work. Okay, so that's a lot. I'm covering a lot here. This graphic is actually meaningless, but it tells a little story, which is that we want data quality over quantity. Like a few hand-picked items are more important to discuss in our management team meetings and our board meetings, and rather than snowing them. Okay, here's another question from real experience to ponder. Have you ever been in a board meeting, maybe you were a board member, where you were handed a, and this will date me a little bit, back in the time where they gave out paper board packets, you're handed a 40 pages of financial statements, and someone said, there's the financial report. Any questions? And how does the room react when you're in a board meeting and someone asks that question? That is the quickest way to suck the oxygen out of a room, is ask people if they have questions about 40 pages of data, because no one knows. First of all, it's intimidating. Second, most people don't really love numbers that way. Even I want to just shut down and think about anything else. I want to think about Star Trek reruns, anything other than think about, like, what is this trying to tell me? But it's just too much information, and it doesn't prioritize what is the essential. So that's the point. If we think of the purpose of a financial report to tell a story, then we will handpick the data that we give them. Think of a movie, like a movie about someone's life. In an hour and a half or 2 hours, they're summarizing a lifetime, and so they have to handpick what scenes are we going to show them. Also, this is just, I like this quote. It's about the importance of not relying on intuition, because our intuition can lead us to false confidence. So data can help us challenge assumptions that we make, and in lots of cases it might back them up. And one thing I've seen is that, and I've noticed this in myself as being a volunteer board member from time to time, is that board members have limited bandwidth to allocate to their volunteer responsibilities, yet they have to make big decisions. And so there's always a tendency to try to simplify things. And how do you simplify it? Well, you tell yourself, or the group tells itself, a story. If we don't tell them what the story really is based on the data, then they will fill in the blanks with their intuition. And so you come up with statements that, when they're repeated enough, they kind of have the veneer of truth. Like, yeah, we're just funded by foundation grants, and that's what we're really good at, so we're going to keep doing that, and that'll be fine for a long time. Well, it might not be, and we have a lot of risk there. So there are things that data can help us with and help us temper our confidence in some of our intuitions, which might not always be correct. Now, Of those 5 metrics, now I'm actually asking you if you could type in the chat. I'm going to go back to that screen, but which of these metrics can help illuminate your organization's financial position? And I realize I didn't really explain program activity or profitability yet, but maybe that intrigues you. So you might enter that. But why don't you just take a minute to type 1 or 2 into the chat? And Tim, what do you see coming through the pipeline?
Yeah, nothing yet. I love months of unrestricted cash. That's a good one.
Yeah.
Programming, activity, profitability,
Okay. Good.
ditto, another one, same topic. Thanks,
Good.
Janet. The same thing, program activity,
Yeah.
profitability.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah. Yeah.
Months of unrestricted, structural budget, surplus. My guess is we're going to hit all of them.
Good. Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good. I'm glad to see people are thinking, and it might
Structural
be,
deficit. People are curious about that.
yeah, yeah. And for different organizations, the metrics that are most essential to the story at a point in time might be different. So that's good. I'm glad to hear there's a lot of interest in these different metrics. Now I'd like to give you an example. Let's look quickly. We'll look quickly at an organization. It's a fictitious organization that is based on an actual case study. So there's some truth behind these numbers, and we'll call it Lake City Community Health. I was doing a training session that was fairly close to Salt Lake City, and I realized that my fictitious name might lead people to think that was a local organization, and I was worried about that. But it's not anywhere near Oregon, so rest assured. Here is a snapshot of their operating statement. Quite see this heading here. What statement of operating activities, which is also called the profit and loss. It's also called the income statement. It has a variety of names. This is the primary financial statement, and it tells you how much money we bring in and how much money did we spend. So this is a condensed version of that. And for this organization, Lake City, you can see a 3-year snapshot, 2 years of actuals, 1 year projected. So take this in and think about, what is the story? And now let me come back here. And here is their statement of financial position. That's also called the balance sheet. So these are the 2 standard financial reports, though I'll tell you what's not standard is to have 3 years here and 3 years of comparative numbers. And it's hard to tell a story looking at one little snapshot in time. So this shows year-end information for this organization. So take this in. What story is it telling us, this organization? And so let's go down here. This is how I want to show this, because this is how my trained eye looks at that same or similar balance sheet information. I'm actually, because I want to look for the essential information, I want to know quickly, what is the real story here? Well, we go to this one, even though it's condensed, there's still a lot of numbers there. So I have to do a fair amount of work. It's burning calories in my brain to figure out what's going on. So if I see just this information, it points me to what's important. So here I can see some trends. Cash and equivalents. What's happening there? Is that good? Is that bad? Now, I also put in the subtotal of current assets and the subtotal of current liabilities, which in my mind, I can do some quick math and get that current ratio. So what is a good current ratio? A good current ratio, one standard is it should be 2 to 1 or better, a 2 to 1 ratio. So if current assets are double what current liabilities are, that's a good thing. However, if it's going, what's the trend there? So what trends do we see or story do we see in this information versus this information that tell us something important about this organization? So what do you notice? And what immediate, I know it's only, there's a lot more to every organization than its financial data, but just based on what you've seen, what's it telling you? So I'll go back to this one, but does anyone have a, like one sentence you could type into chat that jumps
It,
out at you? And it
Scott,
would be just a piece of a story.
yeah, Jessica put in a while ago, forecasting a loss. Then Janet says consistent decline in cash reserves and an increase in all areas of operating costs. Bigger budget,
Yeah.
I mean, bigger deficit, sorry.
Yes, that is.
Need more revenue.
Well, do you need more revenue or do you need less expense? See, that's where we would need more information to know that because, but clearly, yeah, I like that. I like those comments. Clearly, this bottom line, these are negative numbers. We don't like to see negative net revenue numbers. Now, that's something that you don't have to be, you don't have to have a PhD in finance to know that. Anyone who's run a household budget knows you can't spend more money than you have. So it's not only that, but it's getting worse over time. So it's troubling. It's a troubling trend. Now, what about this? I'll show you the grayed out version that my mind consciously, focuses on certain numbers. I think we heard a comment there. Yeah, the cash is going down. Yeah, that is kind of alarming. And let me tell you something else. This is a health organization, so they get some restricted funds. This cash number on their financial statement is not hugely helpful. It's a little bit helpful, but it doesn't break down unrestricted versus restricted cash. Their cash balance is going down, which cannot be good. But it's possible that some of that cash is restricted, which makes it even worse. Also, think about what's the ratio. Remember, I said I like to see 6 months or more, 6 to 12 months of unrestricted cash. Let's pretend that all this cash is unrestricted, which is unlikely to be the case. But if we're projecting like less than 200,000, round numbers are fine, by the way, for financial strategy. We don't care about accuracy the way an accountant would. $200,000 in a budget of 2.5 million, that's less than 10%. And that's nowhere near 6 months. 6 months would be 50% of their total expense. And what we want to see is, so what we really want to see is $1.3 million. This is if they're a fundraising organization, and that they do get funded mostly by grants. So government grants and private grants. So yeah, I would like to see a 6-month reserve there. That would be 1.3 million. And look what they have right there. So it's telling us a story. And unfortunately, this was based on a real organization, and the board wasn't getting the story. Needless to say, they didn't have a financial strategy. And this is an organization that had a lot of strengths, by the way. And there's a whole case study in another seminar that we get into, and we could all be. I find that nonprofit executive directors are the best management consultants, and just in terms of diagnosing what the challenges are. And there are a lot of issues under the surface, like an onion, you pull it away. But the financial statements show you from the beginning, well, there is really a particular story here that we have to understand. So what do you think their big questions, financial questions are? Let's brainstorm. Just think about, if you could think about what would one big financial question be?
Scott, there's a leftover comment here from Mike. The current ratio was 4-1. Now it's 2-1. Just
Exactly.
shows the
Yeah,
power of that current ratio.
exactly. It shows a decline in liquidity. And that means they're in danger of running out of money.
Ouch.
Yeah. Well, and the problem is, unless they have a line of credit, that could actually force them to close their doors. Uh, Cash flow isn't really a strategic concern, but it becomes an emergency when you're running out of money. So
It's existential.
yeah. So when you're running out of money, you don't sit around and think about, well, what's our 5-year projections? That's not what you're worried about. You're worried, how the heck can I fund payroll next week or next month? Well, what do you think their big financial questions are? Just a couple of them. Any ideas?
Any place to cut costs?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Cost cutting. The great thing about cost cutting is that's something we have control over in a way that we don't necessarily have control over revenues.
Why is revenue going down? Any potential funding breakthroughs on the horizon?
Yeah.
Um, Increased fundraising?
Yeah.
There's
Are
only
there
two
ways?
parts to this. You got to cut costs or increase
Yeah.
revenue.
Right. And you almost have to think on both fronts. Are there ways that we can spend our money differently? Are there ways that we can eliminate certain types of expenses uh, in the short term, while also focusing on perhaps what investments can we make in bringing in new fundraising? What are reasonable projections of what this new fundraising could bring in? So yeah, there's a lot there. And in the interest of time, I'll keep moving, but think about this organization and what their kind of questions are. Now think about your own organization's financial statements. How well do they convey the story of your financial status? It's something to think about. Um, and what changes might help you tell the story to your board and senior staff members? So using data to tell the story. Um, this is mostly a thought exercise for you. So uh, if we had time, it would be fun and interesting to look at some actual financial statements in the group and think about, like, here's what I love about them. Here's what might make them more informative. One thing I'll say is that I'm going to go back here. What I like about this one is it's condensed. It has less information than the longhand report that you might print from QuickBooks or your financial software. Because, the field of accounting is about accuracy. It's fundamentally about, we want to be accurate. And so all the lines get printed out because, someone has to scrutinize them at some level. But for telling the story, if we condense the chart and also expand it in time. So in one sense, we're condensing it vertically by using categories instead of the individual line items or accounts, but we're also expanding it to a 3-year view so we can get that bigger picture. That gives us a different story than the longhand statement. And so for a board meeting, for a senior staff meeting, something like this will lead us to perhaps a more fruitful, more generative discussion. And this was actually one of the problems in this organization, is the board didn't understand the situation. And I suspect that's a strong reason why. Also, this is a little thing, but I always like to mention it when I think of it. We round to whole dollars at least. Now, these are all round numbers. We actually could round to this chart to thousands of dollars and still get the exact same story, but with less ink on the page. And more white space is easier to digest the information. Although when you take out the thousands, usually that only very large organizations do it. When you take out the thousands, then your mind has to recompute, like, what am I looking at here? But I can't tell you how many financial statements I see from, like, for example, $10 million organizations that include the cents in all the financial reports. It's like you can hardly even buy anything for $1 anymore. So that's irrelevant information. It makes it harder to read the financial statement. So anyway, that's a very tactical comment there. So
Scott, there's a quick question. I don't know if you have time, but it's around access to information.
yeah,
So, who gets access to this information? Is it development directors? Is it like, how do you decide who gets what information? Do you have time for that?
that is actually a very, very important question. And I can share my opinion. It might be different in different organizations, but the now a lot of nonprofits will share their financial statements on their website, like their 990 forms and or their audits. The two should actually tie together, so it should be the same financial information. And by the way, in parentheses, you can use your 990 to tell your story. It's a public document, and very often folks have their auditor just fill out the 990 and file it. And so your auditors are great at what they do, but they're not marketing or communications professionals. So you actually can tell your story in the 990. Here's what we accomplished. Here's what our mission is. Here's our accomplishment. Here's where we're going. But I think that the regular monthly or quarterly financial statements should always go to the senior staff in an organization, whether or not they're overseeing finance, all the senior staff. And then there should be discussion about it. And I think the board as well. The board members should get regular financial reports. They have to, because they have legal duties to oversight the finances. And I think it helps them do their job by simplifying the statements. As odd as that sounds, less is more. It helps them do their legally required job. I generally wouldn't share internal statements outside the staff or the board. And depending on the size of the organization, I don't think it's relevant to most staff positions to see the financial statements, though the financial story is important to share with staff. And so, everyone in the organization has some stake in the organization's financial success, but they don't need to see the financial statements. So I would say usually senior staff and board.
And to make sure they understand what they're reading, whoever it is.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, a one-page narrative or a two-page narrative can be very helpful. You literally can tell the story on paper.
Nice.
Okay, very good. I love the question. Now I'm going to introduce some things, and I'm going to very quickly, and if anyone wants more resources on this, actually, Tim, why don't I share with you a couple of links that people can go to dig in deeper if they would like to. But program and activity analysis, this is where we get into that metric of internal profitability. It's an interesting way to generate some data to help you understand the dynamics of your internal finances. Matrix mapping is a tool. This is the matrix, and this is a method that was developed about 20 years ago. One of the people cited here has the same last name as me. There is no relation. And this is a very interesting and not highly technical exercise. In fact, it can't be overly technical, but or it probably won't work. But you map out on this grid the different activities of your organizations. That would include the programs, would also include fundraising, and you might even separate out things like special events. And there are 4 quadrants. So you see the 2 axes. How much impact does this have on our mission, which is something that a group can develop together, even though it's not measurable, like literally you can have a reasonable discussion and allocate values to it. Then financial performance, which is an actual calculation. And if you determine, you look at the full costs of everything. That's important. And the next slide will comment on that. Some things there's a tendency to only look at the direct expense, but the indirect expense can be a very substantial level. It can even sometimes be as high as the direct expense. So we understand what each activity's full cost is, then it might not look as good as we thought it did. But Typically, nonprofits have a bunch of activity in this top left corner. That's something that a for-profit business wouldn't want to have, but a nonprofit almost always does. Then we have these things, the stars, which have both high mission impact and high sustainability. And then these lower quadrants are interesting. We have low mission impact and high sustainability, which really means it's making money, but it's not closely aligned to our mission. And some of that activity is allowable. Too much of it becomes a problem, but some of it is certainly allowable. You can have money generators in-house. And then you have these things here that has a stop sign because stuff that's not spot on with our mission and it is bad for our financial sustainability. So you can plot out what your organization's map looks like on this matrix. Now, I'll just show you this slide for reference. Full cost accounting it's a method that allows us to allocate these shared expenses, administration and other shared expenses to the different programs, and allows us to get a clear view of how much do things really cost, because you can't run a program independent of the finance department, the HR department, the copier machine, and of course the executive director. We can't, and that's why I hate, like, there are, Charity Navigator and some of these sites that they use these, I think, completely bogus metrics, such as how much money is spent on program versus administration, as if spending money on administration is a waste. And that is absurd. You can obviously spend too much on administration, but the idea that any money spent on these things is bad, I strongly object to. Now, this is just some animation there, gives you a little more information. We can't go into this in detail, but there's more resources on this. So very quickly, here's a picture of the matrix map for this Lake City organization. And what we see here is, yes, some of their core mission programs are losing money. No surprise there, because the organization as a whole was losing money. But maybe a little bit surprising, they have a program that's actually making money, and it's about housing, which, they're a health organization, but they have a housing program that's doing well financially. And then their fundraising, now their mission isn't to raise money, but they do raise money. Almost always you would see fundraising in this category, but believe it or not, I once consulted with an organization doing a business plan where we found that fundraising was losing money. Think about that for a minute. Unbelievable. They would actually be doing better financially if they stopped fundraising. That was an organization that had government income primarily. And this was something that was very hard for them to digest. But the idea was that they were not allocating their money in an optimal way. And here's a fascinating thing. Look at this one here. This organization had a huge special event, an auction. I don't know if that was their only event, but their special events were actually losing money. And this is something that you hear a lot. Fundraising professionals don't usually recommend relying on special events for this reason, that a lot of events don't do very well. So we could imagine some potential strategies to consider here financially. We could try to move these programs over here by creatively thinking about expenses or even revenues. We could consider eliminating one of them or both of them. We could consider changing the mission and focusing on housing. Not necessarily saying that would be best for the community, but it's an idea. We could consider drawing a big X through these special events. And we could consider investing more in fundraising that might have better returns, such as individual giving, which is also lower risk in addition to perhaps being more cost effective. So the matrix map illuminates and gives us data that's not available on financial statements. So in the interest of time, I want you just to think about this. What strategies can we imagine? And then in your organization, could you picture having a really rich discussion from information like this? So I'll save this discussion. I'd like to have some time at the end for Q&A so we can raise other issues perhaps of particular interest to you. So let's keep this in mind. We can always come back to it. Okay, what's going on? I think I want to go here. And so I am interested, does your organization have any star activities that you believe help to drive your economic engine? These are things aligned with your mission that also drive your financial health in a positive way. And do you have any activities that may drive down your performance? And this question in blue, how would you confirm this? Because that's the ultimate question about data and data-based decision making is, how do we confirm our beliefs? You always start with a hypothesis. And sometimes we find out when we really dig into it that our hypothesis was exactly spot on. Other times we found that, well, if we were assuming 5 things, maybe we found that 3 of them were true, 1 of them maybe we're not sure, and then 1 of them was proved to not be true. And I do a lot of financial modeling as part of developing business plans with nonprofits, and that's usually a typical ratio. Sometimes we do confirm, I'd say for every 5 assumptions that existed at the beginning, we usually confirm 2 or 3 of them, and then 2 or 3 maybe, or I'm sorry, 1 or 2 maybe are unclear. They're kind of in the middle. And then 1 of them usually we debunk as a, just a kind of an idea that just wasn't really true, a widespread idea. So it's an interesting way to rethink. Now, here's something that I have a white paper that I can share with you on this, that it's my business model construct for nonprofits. There's a systematic way to analyze your business model. I'm just going to show you there are 5 elements here. The interesting thing here is that of the 5, only the last one is actually about raising revenue. The others are about ensuring that the whole, basically the whole operation is intact from the concept of what is our purpose here, what is our mission related activity, and what are the nuts and bolts within our operations that we need to have here. Looking at value propositions to our funders and to other partners and stakeholders. And then finally, we get, if there's a problem in any one of these first 4, it can be very hard to raise money. And so if we think about Lake City, they hadn't revisited any of these issues in recent years. It's a classic organization that was kind of in decline, partly because they were stuck in the past and they weren't adapting, and they didn't have very good internal analysis or information. So they had a variety of problems. Excuse me. Okay, so let's talk about the revenue structure though. So the revenue mix is basically a pie chart. I think of the different slices of this pie. Every organization has a pie chart like this. I think of the slices as being funding streams. A funding stream would be like foundation grants. You can see the ones on the bottom. Client fees, merch sales. I wouldn't count on that as a big funding stream usually, but it's an example. Government funding is another one that's not listed here. Other types of fees for service. And then, so with Lake City, this is their revenue structure, I think, for 2025 projections. And this picture helps contribute to the story as well. So what we see is government fee for service is a big chunk of this. And that's good as long as the government program doesn't end, which is something, for anyone here who's relying on federal funding, I mean, that's quite a topic this week, is will my program continue or will it not? So they rely on government, which it is fee for service, so there's some good news there. Foundation grants is this slice here, this brownish gold. And that, I mean, it's nice to have that money, but foundation grants are among the highest risk funding streams because funding priorities can change, and losing a big grant can be a sudden shock to the system. So we consider that to be a relatively high risk funding streams. So we want to emphasize those that are lower risk in our financial strategy. Special events, this blue one, what's interesting about this? It's a pretty big slice of the pie, and it's actually losing money. So this is just the gross revenue that it brings in. But then we're spending money on it. So that's a pretty challenging one to have as that big a slice of this organization's pie chart. And then individual giving, which is often considered to be the best fundraising source from a standpoint of risk and predictability. And that's a tiny slice. They just don't have much of it. And they get people to come to their event, and that's how they support the organization. But that's an expensive way to get that support. So, illustrates the point. Okay, so I'm quickly cover this topic of financial leadership. And again, this topic properly justifies a longer conversation. But I just want to quickly go through some concepts here, and then we can have a little bit of discussion. And I do mean a little bit. I'm looking at the clock. We want to manage our time. But financial leadership is about telling the story and engaging people, getting out in front. And financial strategy, if nothing else, is about being proactive. But we want to build alignment around here's where we're going, and here's a direction we're going. We want everyone to see themselves in that plan. With leadership, we want to make good decisions. We want to involve stakeholders as appropriate. I mean, every stakeholder doesn't need to be in every decision. Then we want to build alignment. Here's where we're going, and how do we build that alignment? And some of that is about relationship skills. This graphic is just about a process for decision making. This is kind of the scientific method. We ask questions, we collect data, we test our assumptions, we generate alternatives, and then we make a decision. And then we test how it's working out after we take action. We put decisions into place. And Lake City is an organization, and perhaps they made some decisions years ago and they haven't questioned those decisions. So they haven't gone back around the loop enough. But that's something leader of the organization can own. We want to start by what are those challenges and needs. Now, this slide shows some symptoms of financial stress. Has anyone here, have you ever experienced any of these symptoms at all? I always laugh when I look at this slide because I'm thinking about my own experience as an executive director, and it's like, yep, check, check, check. Not now, but yeah, last year. And, pretty much a universal list that organizations will experience these at some point in time. Now, those are symptoms, but what are these sources? Well, here are some of those sources, and this is where leadership comes in handy, because you can be the one as leader of your organization who can identify these underlying sources. Here's why we're feeling these stresses. Over dependence on restricted grants is a common thing in nonprofits, because the restricted grants often don't pay for enough of those core administrative costs. If you remember that slide that showed the circles of the it's sometimes called overhead, those shared administrative and other shared expenses, restricted grants often don't pay their fair share there. So you can actually grow and make the stress worse if you underfund those core capacity elements, because they're essential to running a good organization. So if we have a lot of fluctuation and risk, that's something we can identify as a problem we need to solve in our plan. Can't cover everything here, but if you see something you'd like to bring up when we get to Q&A in a few minutes, keep that in mind. But not setting financial goals actually can be a source of underlying stress. And inadequate reserves, yeah, that's always a thing if your reserves aren't adequate. So as a leader, you can articulate those big questions, chart out a planning process, and then identify and engage those key stakeholders who should be involved. And every stakeholder doesn't have to be involved, but the key ones. Who are your big funders? Who are your big partners? Are they, government officials, elected officials, foundation funders, major donors? Figure out who that core is. And then you can be the center of the relationship building, the communication. So putting this leadership in action. How do we engage stakeholders? There's just some suggestions. I've always found that telling that big stakeholders, such as major individual donors, to pick one group, they really appreciate it when you sit down and say, here are the challenges we're facing. There's always a tendency, especially with big, perhaps more so with big foundations, and maybe certainly if you have a big government contract, is you don't want them to see the dirty laundry. But sometimes telling them the honest truth can actually be a way to really engage them more deeply, because they know something's going on there. And when you share more information with them, this isn't universal, but often it will increase empathy and increase their stake in helping you find solutions. It builds trust. So telling stories and building trust, it's about relationships. So there's some suggestions about the financial storytelling. It's a very effective leadership method. And simplifying the story too, not talking about the paper clips. Now, we ran a program with NAO, Tim knows this well, about success factors based on some applied research that my firm did in partnership with NAO. And here are some financial success factors. We found this in the research that differentiated the most successful nonprofits from the least successful nonprofits. Goal setting, investing in revenue generation, such as fundraising, diversification of revenue streams. So one detail I'll mention is having at least 3 different revenue streams that are at least 20% of that pie. That's, if you had to identify an ideal, that might be it. Emphasizing the lower risk revenue streams more, and then a renewability of revenue streams. That's why individual giving is better than foundation giving, because renewability tends to be higher. And just being intentional about those internal profits and subsidies when you have those heart quadrant programs, being very intentional about that, not just saying, well, we can't stop doing that. I know we're losing money, and making sure that it's a choice that you're making rather than a default. This slide, I'm just going to show you. This is dealing with risk. It just summarizes the ways we can deal with risk. I just talked about diversification here, and that's where diversification is a risk management strategy. And I talked previously about in budget performance using income risk indicators to develop more conservative and more proactive, perhaps, budgets. Might help you plan in a more tangible way. So we now have some time where we can have a discussion. Now, and I can open it up to any questions you have about this program. I know we've covered a lot, but I'm interested in what I am certainly interested in what stressors your organization faces. Um, do you think your major stakeholders understand these stresses? One common one is if the core of the organization, like the back office functions like finance and technology, getting data systems that work well for everybody, those are challenges in organizations of all sizes. Um, and do the funders, like even government agencies, do they understand what it takes to run an organization and the kind of challenges that you're dealing with? Um, and how will those funders react to engagement with them? So for example, if you have a foundation that just flat out will not pay for overhead and they'll only give you restricted grants for programs, how will they react to a discussion that invites them in to say, we really have to have an unrestricted component of our funding, and here's why? How would they react? What are your thoughts on this? And I'll open it up more broadly. Is there any burning question around financial strategy, either that we've covered or something maybe we didn't cover today that we could have a discussion about? Feel free to type it in the chat, and Tim, let me know what you see.
I also encourage people to raise their hands.
Yes, I can't actually see all the hands um, on my screen, so Tim, let me know.
You bet.
And you can unmute yourself as well.
Yeah, just jump in. Just there is a question in the chat about the success factor paper, Scott, and how do people get access to it? I sent out the link to your publications on your website. So all of your
Yeah.
papers are there, the business model, the best practices, myth or facts. It's all there at your
Well,
website.
I'll tell you what, Tim, what I can do is I can send you a link to the specific success factors white paper. There's also a business model methodology white paper that people might want. And then I'll also find one related to matrix mapping that I can send out. That's not my methodology, but there are some things out there. And then, with the slides, that'll give people some things to chew on.
Perfect. Brianna, would you be willing to come off mute and ask your question there?
Oh, sure. I would say this isn't really a question so much as like a share out, but so I'm on a board and we get a 25%, it's about 25% of our revenue every year is from a government grant, but they're unreliable with timing and it's reimbursement based. And so that just poses a really big challenge for our cash flow because obviously it's such a large percentage. And we have okay reserves. We've got about 3 to 6 months, but we can't just do this indefinitely. And then they keep changing the timing every year. So we are trying to diversify more and rely less on this grant. But when it's been so consistent and such a high percentage, it's challenging to make up the difference.
It is, and it creates another ongoing challenge of cash flow management, which the solution to a lot of these problems, I mean, it doesn't solve the problem, but it what it does is makes it easier to manage, is having a 6-month cash reserve so that you can plot out. We actually have a cash flow projection tool, and there are others probably out there on the internet where you can project 12 months forward at any point in time what your cash flow will be. And with government funding, there's often a time lag, especially if it's reimbursement based. And to the extent that you have kind of a wave function of cash flow, it can help you plan around that. But a lot of organizations that get a lot of government funding, they tend to have very small cash reserves, and that can really create a cash flow crunch. The money's going to come, but you don't know exactly when, or you know when, and it's not at a convenient time. There have been cases where nonprofits have actually gone bankrupt because of that exact factor. They knew the money was coming, but the there have been state government shutdowns and things like that that have just made the time lag worse. So I think that focusing on a strategy of building a cash reserve is something that would be a practical step, but also diversifying funding to things like individual giving, if that's possible. Other types of fee for service that are more immediate in terms of cash flow. Definitely is a strategic question.
There's another question in chat around template for a board report. I think that's what it was. Do you have a financial dashboard template that you recommend?
I'll check. There might be something like that, but I mean, you could think of those slides about Lake City, the operating statement there, as a sort of, it's not a template, but it's sort of a model. You can set something up in Excel. If you export your financial data to Excel and then spend some time to consolidate line items into a relatively few categories of expense and categories of revenues, that would basically produce the same thing. I will check and see. I may have from an older, like back when we did things in person, we used to have these longer full day sessions, and I might have a template from that. But that's a good question. And I love the idea of changing the way we report to boards with less/more information, less details and more big picture. Anything else occur to people? Tim, you're a past executive director. Did anything strike you in thinking about this? Like, I bet you had some flashbacks here.
For sure. Yeah, and yeah, absolutely. Gosh, I don't have a specific call out. It's I just think that strategy piece is really important. And of course, once you bring data and a story honestly to a group, do you have enough diverse perspectives on that story? Is there this inclusion element around,
Yep.
Some people get embarrassed by some of the financial data, and others just see through the fact
Yeah.
this is going to impact clients. It's going to have a devastating impact on people that are supposed to receive services. So
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just kind of maybe a more general comment around. I
Yeah.
think that story is so important, but do you have that
Yeah.
diverse perspective?
Tim, you reminded me of something that is important to emphasize, is that I see we have one more question, but I just want to make this point, is that lots of people feel intimidated by financial data, and they shouldn't be, but it just, we have to recognize it is inherently intimidating, and we have to demystify it. And so some of some of your best strategic thinkers on your board will not be financial people. And if we simplify the story, simplify the data, we invite them in. And if we fail to do that, then we have that dead silence, or we have that we only get the financial minds in the room really commenting on it, but those might not be diverse perspectives if only the financial people are commenting on it. So that's really important. Now, I saw that we had one more question there, a hand raised. Can we address that in the last minute?
Yeah, Scott, we're just oh, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Oh, sorry. It was a question that I typed in earlier in regards to how much or what level of details should staff have, and I was being more specific to a development director or director of development.
Yeah.
I know this is an opinion, but I was curious, what would be the essentials 5% that a director of development and communications should see or focus on and or
I-
have access to?
I would want to know, if I were a director of development, I would want to know about details about the revenue streams. I would be less concerned about costs and expenses in the organization. So details about those revenue streams, what is really driving them? What do we get out of our fundraising data system that ties to our accounting system that tells us what are the trends and how can we build our most desirable funding streams there. So that's a short answer to probably what could be a good discussion, and that's true of a lot of these topics. We are now at 10:30, so I think we have to end it there. But I want to thank all of you for attending. I want to thank NAO as always for hosting these programs, and it helps move our sector forward in the great state of
Absolutely.
Oregon.
Scott, thank you so much. I do have a couple slides. If people need to go, I completely understand. Love to share just a
Go
couple
ahead.
slides.
I'll stop my share.
Now it takes me a minute to get to the slides. Where are they? Just again, want to thank our sponsors. Absolutely important to the work that we do and we all do in our sector. Also, NAO is focused in this legislative session on getting SB 602 passed, can dramatically improve the way the government does its grants and contracts. So please take a look at that and support our efforts. This is a list of some of the upcoming trainings for this particular network. Like I say, we have 7 different networks, so there's lots of trainings out there, both virtual and in person. Please take advantage of those. Quick look at our conference schedule. It's kind of busy with the first one coming up in Eugene at the end of February. The big one in Ashland, 350 people come to that. Yes, last year was my first year there. It's a great conference. I highly recommend um, checking that one out. And then we're going to be in Eastern Oregon at the end of May and Portland at the middle of October. Gosh, my screen went blank. So I think that's pretty much, we'll just end it there. And again, say thanks everyone for your time. Scott, thank you so much. The recording will be sent out afterwards.
Thank you.